Hey everybody, I'm Mario Escobedo. Thanks for checking out Equipped. This is a YouTube channel dedicated to adding value to your spiritual growth through Bible study. So hit that subscribe button. There's an arrow up in the top right corner of this video where you can hit that and share this video on Facebook or whatever social media platform that you use. I'd really appreciate you doing that, giving it a like, leaving some comments in the comment section below. This video is part of a series that I'm doing on the prophet Joel, a passage by passage study on the prophecy of the book of Joel, or in the book of Joel. And so we're going passage by passage, not verse by verse. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes on one verse. No, it's just a passage by passage study. And today we're looking at the first passage in the book of Joel, which is chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. So let's dive in and let's look at that. Now, here's the passage, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read this. It's zoomed out for a reason. The font is way too small for you to be able to read it. I understand that. If you have a chance, hit pause and go get your Bible. I'm using the NIV. Use the version of your choice and read Joel chapter 1, verses 2 through 12, and then come back and let's go through this together. I'd recommend you doing that. But here's what I've done. Here's the passage, right? Here in this passage, one major big idea is developed, and that's what we're going to want to get to. We want to discover what's that big idea that Joel wants us to take away from this passage, chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. And what I've done is I've divided this passage into 4 paragraphs. And our method, what we're doing is that we're going to look for the main idea of each paragraph. And once we've done that, that's going to help us discover what the main idea is for the entire passage. Once we have the main idea for the whole passage, we're going to ask 2 questions. Number 1, what did it mean for them back there and back then at that time? That's an important question to ask, and that's really the first question we should ask before we begin looking for application to our own life. The second question we're going to ask is, okay, now that I know what it meant for them back there and then, what could it possibly mean for me right now and right here in my own life? So let's jump into this. We've got 4 paragraphs, and we're going to zoom into each paragraph and look at it individually to discover what's the main idea of each individual paragraph. Paragraph number 1, verses 2 through 4, here's how they read. And by the way, here's verse 1. I'm not including it as part of the paragraph simply because it's the introduction for the entire book. So the paragraph, for me, the passage really starts right here in verse 2. Here's what it says. Joel, speaking to the people of Israel or Judah, says this: "Hear this, you elders. Listen, all who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation," 3 generations down. "What the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. And what the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten." So this big event that Joel is saying, has anything like this ever happened? What he's talking about is this massive locust plague that has swept through the countryside and has just devastated everything. They didn't leave anything behind whatsoever. And this is such a monumental, such a huge event that Joel asks, has anything like this ever happened? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is no. I mean, this is pretty massive. This is pretty huge. And Joel is saying, yeah, and since it's such a big deal, you should tell your children and their children and their children and their children. 3 generations down the road, this is how big this event is and how important it is for Joel that he wants them to tell this story 3 generations down the road. Okay, so we've read that, right? We've got a general idea of what's going on there. Massive locust plague, tell future generations about it. And what we want to do now is discover or identify what is the main idea of just these verses right here, just this paragraph. If we had to identify the main idea, what would we select? And the key here is to use only the words of the biblical text. Don't paraphrase, don't put it in your own words, just highlight the biblical text itself to discover, to identify the main idea of this paragraph. Here's what I've selected. Oop, went too far back, sorry about that. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? That, for me, that question that Joel really begins his message with, that question for me is the main idea for this paragraph right here. If someone were to ask me, Mario, what is Joel chapter 1 verses 2 through 4 about? This is how I would respond. Something big happened, and Joel really wants the people to understand this is big, this is massive. So for this one paragraph right here of the whole passage, right? We have the whole passage, verses 2 through 12. But for this one paragraph only, for me, the main idea is that question right there. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Let's go on to the next paragraph. Verses 5 through 8. Let's read them briefly. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you drinkers of wine. Wail because of the new wine, for it's been snatched from your lips. A nation has invaded my land, a mighty army without number. It has the teeth of a lion, the fangs of a lioness. It's laid waste my vines and ruined my fig trees. It's stripped off their bark and thrown it away, leaving their branches white. Mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the betrothed of her youth. So what Joel does here in this paragraph is that he addresses a very specific segment of the society. He's talking to those people who drink wine and probably do it in excess. And he's saying, you guys should really be sad about this locust plague because you can't get drunk anymore. You've lost all ability to get drunk because the locusts have stripped everything bare. There's no more material, no more produce to make wine with. You should wail, you should mourn, you should be sad about this. If I had to identify the main idea for this paragraph right here, it'd be exactly that, what Joel says here. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. He's addressing that specific segment of society saying, you're in trouble. You can't carry out your functions or do what you would normally do, go and get drunk, because the locusts have come. And look how Joel identifies the locusts in verse 6. He uses this metaphoric, poetic language. A nation has invaded my land. And this is important because we're going to see why in the next passage, why this is important, that Joel is talking about a locust plague, but he's talking about something else too. We'll see that in the next video for the next passage. But here for me is the main idea for this paragraph only. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep, because the locusts have swept through the land, gotten rid of all the vineyards. There's no produce left to make wine. You can't get drunk anymore. That's the main idea, in my opinion, for this paragraph. Let's go on to the third paragraph, verses 9 and 10. Here's what Joel says. Grain offerings and drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord, from the temple of the Lord. The priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord. The fields are ruined. The ground is dried up. The grain is destroyed. The new wine is dried up. The olive oil fails. Now, identifying the main idea for this paragraph for me is pretty easy, because here Joel is talking about yet another segment of society. The previous paragraph, he was talking to the drunkards, right? He directed his attention to them. Now he's talking about the priests. And so the drunkards were supposed to mourn and wail, but now the priests are also mourning. So in my opinion, that's the main idea for this paragraph. The priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord. Why is it that the priests are in mourning? Well, they can no longer offer grain offerings or drink offerings. These were elements that were essential to the worship system of the nation of Israel or Judah. They needed these things to keep the worship, the religion of Israel going. They needed those things. But as we notice down here, the fields are ruined, the ground is dried up, grain is destroyed, new wine is destroyed, olive oils. All these things, all this produce and harvest was necessary and part of the priests being able to offer grain offerings and drink offerings, being able to keep the worship, the religious system for the people going. So if all that is dried up, then the priests are in mourning because they don't have the stuff that they need to express their worship to the Lord, to keep that relationship the way they used to do it, to keep that relationship intact with the Lord. So the priests are in mourning. They can't carry out their functions as priests. They can't minister to the Lord on behalf of the people. Therefore, they are in mourning. So the locust plague has done something pretty devastating, not only for the drunkards, but really for the entire nation, because in a manner of speaking, their worship system, their religion, and it's broken. They can't do it anymore because there aren't the elements necessary to do that. Let's go on to the next paragraph. This is the last paragraph, verses 11 and 12. Despair, you farmers, wail, you vine growers, grieve for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field is destroyed. The vine is dried up and the fig tree is withered, the pomegranate, the palm, and the apple tree. All the trees of the field are dried up. So surely the people's joy is withered or dried up as well. So we have yet another segment of society. We have the drunkards, the priests, and now the farmers and the vine growers. So for me, it's pretty easy to identify the main idea of this paragraph. Despair, you farmers, wail, you vine growers. Why? because their livelihood has completely been taken away from them. The locusts have gone through their fields, have gone through all their plants and everything that they used to live, to sell to other people. They've eaten absolutely everything, so there's nothing left for them to live off of. So of course, they're going to despair and wail, because how are they going to live now? What are they going to live off of? Now, bear in mind, these people live off of this stuff, right? They sell it to others. But if they have nothing to sell, well, that affects their own personal economy, but it also affects everyone else who would have bought from them. What are they going to eat? So what we see developing here is a pretty tragic picture happening for the people that Joel is addressing. So let's zoom back out at the passage level, right? Here are the 4 paragraphs once again, and we have a main idea for each paragraph. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Big thing has happened, the locust plague. And then 3 segments of society that this locust plague has affected. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. The priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord, and despair, you farmers, wail, you vine growers. The picture that is developing here in this entire passage is that the locust plague has really devastated the entire nation. This is a national tragedy. This has devastated the national economy for the people that Joel is addressing. Their national economy is devastated. Their national agriculture has been devastated. And because the priests are addressed here, their national religion, their worship system has also been affected because of this locust swarm, this locust attack. So you have a pretty grim picture that's being described here in the first passage of the book of Joel. Devastating event that has affected different segments of society, but really has resulted in a national calamity for the people Joel is addressing. Now that we've identified the main idea for each of the paragraphs in this passage, our job is to identify the big takeaway, the main idea for this entire passage. What is the one huge major takeaway that Joel would have us learn from this passage? Now, you and I might have a different opinion, but I bet we'll be pretty close in what we select. And again, just like we did with the main idea for each paragraph, we're going to use only the words of the biblical text itself. No paraphrasing, no putting it in our own words at this point. We'll do that later. But here's what I have identified as the main idea for the whole passage. It's in verse 8, and it's this: mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the betrothed of her youth. Joel is describing just how devastating this event is and what the level of mourning at a national level should be. You should be mourning, the people he's addressing, you should be mourning just like a young bridegroom, or a young bride, whose fiance has just died before they've been able to get married. How devastating would that be? Well, that's how devastating this event is. And our mourning as a nation, our lamenting and our wailing and our crying, our mourning should reach that level, because that's how devastating this event is. So again, if we zoom out, this is what our passage looks like now. We have 4 paragraphs, each one with its own main idea, and then highlighted here in red is the main idea for the entire passage, right? And we see this picture developing. National tragedy devastates the economy, devastates the agriculture, devastates the worship system, and so the prophet Joel is wanting the people to mourn. That can sound kind of weird, because typically you would think of a prophet of wanting to encourage the people, but that's not what Joel is doing here. So we have to ask our question right now at this point, okay? What did it mean for them back then and there? If Joel is trying to get them to this understanding where, hey, you need to mourn what's taking place, why does Joel want that to happen? Why is he telling the people to mourn? Why isn't he encouraging them and saying, hey, don't worry, things are going to be all right? Why is he taking a different approach, and why is he telling the people mourn, and drunkards you should wail, and priests are mourning, and the farmers they're in despair? Why would Joel call the people to lament and to mourn? Here's what I think it meant for them back there at that time. Joel wanted the people to mourn so that they could recognize that God was trying to tell them something through the locust plague. Joel is trying to get their attention and say, hey, Something bigger than a locust plague is happening here. And Joel's going to tell us more in the next passage, the next video. Something bigger than a locust plague is happening here. We need to pay attention. And the first step, the first thing we need to do in order to pay attention to what God is trying to tell us is mourn what has just happened. Because when we mourn, what's going to happen is that is eventually going to lead us to repentance. We'll see that in the next passage. If we begin by mourning, it's going to lead us to repentance. It's going to take us back to the Lord. But we have to mourn. We have to recognize that through this locust plague, the Lord is trying to warn us and tell us something bigger than just a locust plague has taken place. And so now that we've answered that question, let's bring it home to us, what it could possibly mean for us. What could it mean for us right here and right now? Now, here's how I've phrased it, okay? And I'm basing this on the main idea for the whole passage where he says, mourn like a virgin in sackcloth who has just lost the betrothed of her youth. Here's how I've worded it for myself as a takeaway for here and now. Sometimes God uses extreme measures to get our attention. And that's just true. Sometimes God uses extreme measures to get our attention. That's what Joel is wanting the people to see. Wants them to mourn so that they could see that this locust plague is not just some other natural locust plague that took place. No, God is using this extreme measure of the locust plague to grab our attention, to tell us something bigger than this is just a locust plague. Something bigger is taking place here. You need to understand that. And in our lives today, sometimes God does use extreme measures to get our attention. Our response to bad situations usually is, God, get me out of this, right? God, let me get through this. And we're trying so much to get out of a bad situation as quickly as we can. Of course, we're going to do that. It's natural. It's human to do that. But at times, we need to pause and just reflect and think, wait a minute, is God perhaps allowing this to happen or using this extreme measure because he's trying to get my attention about something? Is it possible, as it was the case in the nation of Israel in the time of Joel, that I'm going down a particular path that will end up in danger or destruction, spiritual destruction for me? And so God is using an extreme measure to get my attention so that I don't go down that path. Sometimes when something bad happens in our lives, we need to pause and think, wait a minute, is God using this? Is God trying to speak to me through something like this? And sometimes it means that you just pause and you mourn what you're going through. You don't try to rush through it, but you have to pause and you have to be mindful of what you're going through, because it's very possible that God is trying to teach you something through that you're going through. He's trying to get your attention on that. Now, here's what I've learned in my life. That God doesn't start with extreme measures, right? When you're going down the wrong path, God doesn't start with an extreme measure. I've noticed that God kind of nudges me at first, right? That first he tries to get my attention in a loving and merciful way because he's a loving and merciful God. He nudges me perhaps. He tries to get my attention in a subtle way, not beating me over the head. But when I consistently ignore what God is trying to teach me or tell me, then maybe he has to amp it up a little bit, turn up the heat a little bit. And if I continue to ignore or just I'm tuned out completely to the voice of God, then it's very possible that sometimes God will have to use extreme measures to get my attention. And I think that's a major takeaway from the book of Joel as a whole, and specifically from this first passage, that Joel is saying, this is an extreme measure God is taking. He has sent this locust plague. He's allowed this locust plague to happen because he's trying to get our attention. There's a bigger message he's trying for us to hear. We just need to stop and make time to mourn so that we can listen and take appropriate action once we've learned what it is that God is trying to teach us. So in this first passage of the book of Joel, for us today, right now, sometimes we just have to stop and recognize at times that God can use extreme measures to get our attention. Our response to that is so crucial, it's so key, and we're going to see what our response should be as we go into the next passage in the book of Joel, which will be in the next video. So hey, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sticking around. I know this was a little bit long. I'd love it very much if you click that subscribe button right below so you can be updated every time I upload a new video, which is weekly. Also, leave a comment if you have a question about what's been covered. I'd love to interact with you in the comments section like this. Also, there's a little arrow up in the top right-hand corner of this video Click on that and you can share this video on your Facebook or any other social media platform that you're using. Thank you very much. I hope this has added value to your spiritual growth. God bless. See you next time.